This channel is not designed for entertainment or viral content. It exists for people who are actively healing, seeking clarity, or exploring the psychology behind their emotions and patterns. Every episode is carefully written and produced with emotional depth, reflection, and care. If you're here expecting casual commentary, high-energy hosts, surface-level discussions, flashy production, or entertainment-focused content, then we gently refer you to other channels offering just that. At Deep Dive, we focus on quiet, deep, and intentional content to support those on a real mental health journey. If that's you, then welcome to our channel. You're in the right place.
Welcome to the Deep Dive channel. Today we're taking a deep dive into a question that touches many lives and carries, well, immense weight. Can childhood trauma cause autism?
It's such a deeply sensitive topic, isn't it? And often really misunderstood. I think for many people, this question pops up because they see how, the behaviors and challenges linked with trauma seem to overlap with things we see in autism.
Yeah, it leads to confusion, maybe fear, sometimes even misplaced blame, right?
Exactly. So our mission today in this deep dive is to try and bring some clarity and hopefully some compassion to this really complex area. We're drawing on what we understand from psychology and neuroscience based on the information we've looked into.
We want to unpack the science, maybe touch on the history of this idea, understand how trauma and autism actually affect the brain differently, and really underline why getting this right is so crucial for support.
Absolutely vital.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Let's just make sure we're clear on the terms. What exactly do we mean by autism spectrum disorder, or ASD?
Right. So when we talk about ASD, we're talking about a neurodevelopmental condition. The key word there is neurodevelopmental. Think of it as someone's brain being wired differently, sort of from the ground up.
Right, from the beginning.
Yes, fundamentally about how the brain develops and processes information very early in life.
And that shows up in how someone, say, communicates socially or experiences the world through their senses, like sounds, lights, textures, and sometimes in repetitive behaviors or really intense interests.
Precisely. Those are the core areas. But just as important, maybe even more important for this discussion, is understanding what autism isn't.
Okay.
And this really can't be stressed enough based on current understanding. Autism is not caused by how someone was parented. It's not caused by emotional neglect. And it is absolutely not caused by life trauma.
It's inherent to their neurology, their developmental path.
That's the understanding, yes. It's part of who they are, neurologically speaking.
So how does that path, that neurological identity actually develop then?
Well, the research points quite strongly towards factors influencing brain development really early on. We're talking genetics, prenatal influences, those critical developmental stages in the first year or two. So
before most major life events would even happen?
Generally, yes. Studies show differences in how brain cells connect, how brain regions talk to each other. And it's so important to frame this as the brain developing differently, following its own unique blueprint, not somehow developing wrongly or defectively.
That differently framing feels much more accurate and certainly more compassionate. Okay, so let's contrast that now with childhood trauma. How are we defining trauma here?
Childhood trauma refers to a whole range of experiences that are deeply distressing, overwhelming for a child's ability to cope. This could be severe abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, or significant neglect, abandonment.
It could also be things like witnessing violence, maybe in the home or community, or chronic instability.
Yes, exactly. Things like homelessness or the sudden difficult loss of a caregiver. These aren't just bad experiences. They're experiences that can fundamentally shake a child's sense of safety and trust in the world around them.
And how does that kind of overwhelming external experience impact a developing brain? Because this is where the key difference lies, right?
This is absolutely the core distinction. Unlike autism, which is about the brain's, let's say, initial wiring plan, trauma impacts a brain that might have been developing along a more typical path before the trauma happened.
Okay.
Prolonged exposure to intense stress and fear essentially puts the brain's stress response system into overdrive. We're talking about areas like the amygdala, the bitter sort of danger detector.
The alarm bell.
The alarm bell, exactly. And the hippocampus, which is crucial for memory and context, and the prefrontal cortex, that's our executive control center, for regulating emotions, planning, making decisions.
So these areas get kind of reshaped or maybe retuned by the traumatic experience.
Precisely. Over time, this constant activation, the flood of stress hormones, it can lead to lasting changes. The brain might become hypervigilant, always scanning for threats. It can become much harder to manage intense emotions. Executive functions like problem solving or holding back impulses can be impaired. Memory might become fragmented or intrusive. It's a kind of reorganization, a reshaping of brain circuits in response to those overwhelming external events. It's not an inherent difference from birth.
That explanation really highlights the different origins, the different pathways. But here's the tricky part, isn't it? Because some of the outward behaviors we might see in someone with a trauma history can look, well, strikingly similar sometimes to certain autistic traits.
Oh, absolutely. The symptom overlap is significant, and it's a major source of confusion.
Things like avoiding eye contact or being really sensitive to loud noises, maybe struggling in social situations.
Yes, you might see social withdrawal, heightened sensory reactions, difficulty managing emotions, maybe behaviors that seem rigid or repetitive. All of these could be seen in both contexts.
So what's the fundamental difference then? You mentioned the origin, but what does that mean for the behavior itself?
Right, it comes down to the underlying reason, the meaning behind the behavior. Let's take eye contact, for example.
Okay.
An autistic person might avoid eye contact because, well, maybe it feels intensely uncomfortable, physically overwhelming to their sensory system. Or perhaps they actually process what you're saying better without that direct visual input.
Yeah.
It's often not about fear of the other person.
It's about their internal processing.
Exactly. Now, someone who survived trauma might avoid eye contact because they've learned, maybe through painful experience, that looking at people can be dangerous, or it triggers intense feelings of shame or fear. Their avoidance is often a protective mechanism, a learned response rooted in hypervigilance.
Ah, I see. So the same behavior, avoiding eye contact, but driven by completely different internal experiences and brain processes.
Precisely. Or think about a meltdown or shutdown. For an autistic child, a meltdown might be triggered by overwhelming sensory input, too much noise, too many lights, or a sudden change that disrupts their need for predictability. It's their nervous system essentially getting overloaded.
Right.
A shutdown in a child with trauma history might be more like dissociation, their brain's way of mentally checking out to escape an unbearable emotional state or a memory triggered by something in the environment.
So while both might look like a loss of control from the outside,
The internal mechanism is different. One is often about processing the external world differently. The other is more likely a survival response to a perceived threat, whether internal or external.
that distinction, focusing on the why and the mechanism, not just the what, feels incredibly important.
It really is. And it's not just academic. It has huge implications for how we offer support.
You know, if this conversation is sparking questions for you listening, or if these distinctions are helping you make sense of something complex in your own life or work, we genuinely love to hear from you. Maybe consider subscribing to the Deep Dive channel.
Yeah, join us for more explorations like this one. And leaving a comment with your thoughts or questions really helps us know what's resonating, what other complex topics you might want us to dive into next.
Definitely. So, if the science is now so clear that trauma doesn't cause autism, where did this idea, this really persistent and, frankly, quite harmful myth even come from?
Well, that takes us back into history, and it's not a comfortable part of the story. A lot of it goes back to some very outdated and now thoroughly discredited theories from the mid-20th century.
Are you talking about the refrigerator mother theory?
That's probably the most infamous example, yes.
Yeah.
Largely linked to psychoanalytic ideas at the time that just completely wrongly blamed parents, especially mothers, for causing autism through supposed emotional coldness or rejection.
It's just devastating to think about.
It was. It confused the kind of emotional detachment or withdrawal you might see in a severely traumatized or neglected child with the inherent differences in social communication and interaction you see in autistic children. It caused immense pain and guilt for families and really stalled genuine understanding for decades.
It feels like a tragic case of seeing two things happen together. Maybe a child being autistic and parents struggling or seeming distant and jumping to the wrong conclusion about cause and effect.
Exactly. Correlation doesn't equal causation. And it is absolutely true that autistic individuals can experience trauma. In fact, they often do.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Why is there this co-occurrence? If trauma doesn't cause autism, why might we see them together so often?
There are several factors that contribute to this, unfortunately. First, autistic individuals can actually be at a higher risk of experiencing trauma. Well, think about it. Navigating a complex social world designed mostly for neurotypical communication styles is already challenging. Differences in understanding social cues, potential communication barriers, Or sometimes social naivety can make autistic people more vulnerable to things like bullying, manipulation, exploitation, or other forms of harm.
They might struggle to recognize danger signals or communicate what's happening.
That can definitely be part of it, yes. Difficulty reporting abuse or articulating their distress clearly is a factor. Second, as we touched on, trauma itself can sometimes create or worsen behaviors that, on the surface, look a bit like autistic traits.
Like the social withdrawal or sensory issues.
Right. A child experiencing chronic neglect or living in a chaotic, unsafe environment might develop significant developmental delays, sensory sensitivities born out of that chaos, or profound social withdrawal as a way to cope, to protect themselves. These are trauma responses, but they could be mistaken for autism.
Which leads directly to the risk of misdiagnosis, I imagine.
Absolutely. If a clinician isn't experienced in both neurodevelopmental conditions and trauma, or maybe doesn't get a really thorough developmental history, they might see those overlapping behaviors.
And jump to the autism label when the main driver is trauma.
Or, conversely, they might miss underlying autism because the trauma responses are so prominent. Or they might misinterpret trauma reactions in an autistic person as just being part of their autism, failing to provide needed trauma support. It gets complicated.
So the core message remains. Seeing them together doesn't mean one caused the other. Trauma doesn't create autism, but it can certainly happen to an autistic person, and trauma responses can sometimes resemble autistic traits.
That's it, exactly. And understanding that separation allows us to really appreciate the distinct neurobiology involved.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper there. Tell us more about the brain differences we actually see in autism compared to the changes from trauma.
Sure. So in autism, brain imaging studies and other research showed differences in brain structure and function that seem to emerge very early, often prenatally or in infancy. You might see differences in the overall size or growth patterns of certain brain areas, or in how efficiently the brain prunes unused connections, a process called synaptic pruning. And crucially, there's often altered connectivity between different brain networks. For example, the default mode network involved in self-reflection, thinking about others, and the salience network, which helps us figure out what's important to pay attention to, often function or connect differently in autistic brains compared to neurotypical ones. These seem to be foundational developmental differences.
They're part of the initial blueprint, so to speak, regardless of later experiences.
Largely, yes. Now contrast that with trauma. The brain changes linked to chronic stress and trauma are generally understood as acquired. They develop over time as the brain adapts, trying to survive in what it perceives as a dangerous world. So here we see things like the amygdala becoming hyperreactive, the alarm bell being stuck on high. We sometimes see changes in the hippocampus, which can impact memory consolidation and retrieval. And we might see reduced activity or connectivity in the prefrontal cortex, affecting that top-down control over emotions and impulses.
So these aren't there from the start. They develop because of the prolonged stress?
Exactly. It's the brain being reshaped by experience, not a difference in its initial developmental trajectory. One is about how the brain was built. The other is about how it responded to significant external pressures.
That distinction feels crystal clear when you put it like that, and it must be so critical when we think about how trauma uniquely impacts someone who is autistic.
It really is. Because if you're starting with that different neurological baseline, maybe heightened sensory sensitivity, different communication style, a strong need for routine, and then you experience trauma, the impact can be compounded.
How so? What does that look like?
Well, experiences that a neurotypical person might find merely stressful or unpleasant could be genuinely traumatizing for an autistic person. Think about invasive medical procedures without proper preparation or sensory accommodation.
Right, that could be terrifying.
Or constant, unpredictable loud noises, bright, chaotic environments, persistent bullying, or social exclusion that feels relentless. These things can overwhelm their already different processing system and lead to trauma responses layered right on top of their autistic traits, making things even more complex.
Which just hammers home why accurate differentiation is vital. Not just for a label, but for getting the right kind of help. So if the symptoms can overlap so much, how do clinicians, families, educators actually figure out what's driving what, especially if both might be going on?
That is a huge clinical challenge. It really demands a careful, thorough, and often quite nuanced evaluation. One of the absolute key pieces is the developmental history.
Meaning what the child was like before any potential trauma.
Exactly. Were there signs consistent with autism differences in social interaction, communication, sensory responses, restricted interest very early on, well before any known traumatic events? If yes, That points strongly towards a neurodevelopmental foundation.
So timing is critical.
Timing is massive. If traits that look like autism only emerge after a significant trauma, then addressing the trauma first, using trauma-informed approaches, becomes the priority. Though you'd still keep evaluating for any underlying neurodevelopmental factors.
What other questions help tease things apart?
Other useful questions are things like, are the challenging behaviors specifically triggered by reminders of the trauma? Do they happen mostly when the person feels unsafe or stressed? Or are they pretty consistent across different situations? Is there a family history of autism or related neurodevelopmental conditions?
It sounds like it takes detective work.
It really does. And ideally, it's not just one person's job. For clinicians, a multidisciplinary assessment is often best getting input from psychologists, perhaps neurologists, speech therapists, occupational therapists.
Getting the full picture.
Exactly. Taking time, gathering history from parents, teachers, the individual themselves if possible, observing across different settings, and importantly, resisting the urge to slap on a label too quickly, based only on surface behaviors.
And what about for families trying to support their child through this complexity? What helps?
Number one is always prioritizing emotional safety and creating a secure base. Really understanding and accepting that your child might be both autistic and affected by trauma, and that both aspects need understanding and support.
Not an either-or situation.
Definitely not. Practically, things like predictable routines, clear communication, visual supports can be incredibly helpful here, and validating their feelings, whether those feelings come from sensory overload or a trauma trigger, are all crucial.
Makes sense. And for teachers or other caregivers?
Creating environments that are both sensory-friendly and trauma-informed is key. This means seeing behaviors like meltdowns not as deliberate defiance, but as signs of overwhelm or dysregulation.
And responding with support, not punishment.
Yes. Providing quiet spaces for regulation, offering choices to give a sense of control, being predictable and reliable. These things build safety, which benefits everyone, but especially those with trauma histories and autistic individuals. Teaching emotional regulation skills is vital too.
Okay, this feels like a good point to maybe tackle some of those common questions head on, sort of like a quick FAQ.
Good idea.
So, first one, can trauma ever make someone autistic?
Based on everything we know, the answer is a clear no. Trauma doesn't cause autism. Different origins, different pathways.
Okay, but can trauma symptoms look like or mimic autism symptoms?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
That overlap in behaviors like social withdrawal, sensory issues, or regulation difficulties is real, which is why that careful assessment is so crucial.
Right. And can someone be autistic and have experienced trauma?
Yes, definitely. It's not only possible, it seems to be quite common, partly because of that increased vulnerability we talked about earlier.
So why does the old misconception that trauma causes autism still hang around?
I think it's a combination of those harmful, outdated theories lingering, plus the real confusion caused by the co-occurrence. People see both together and make that incorrect causal link.
And how do professionals actually tell the difference when the symptoms overlap so much?
It comes back to that comprehensive look. The deep developmental history, the timing of symptom onset, the context and triggers for behaviors and their consistency across different situations. It's about the whole pattern, not just isolated symptoms.
Got it. Does having trauma make existing autism symptoms, worse?
It certainly can intensify them, yes. Trauma can heighten sensory sensitivities, make emotional regulation even harder, increase anxiety, maybe lead to more pronounced social withdrawal layering difficulties on top of existing autistic traits.
And just briefly, what does trauma-informed support really mean in this context?
It means creating environments and interactions built on safety, predictability, trustworthiness. It means understanding potential triggers, focusing on strengths, offering choices, and prioritizing emotional co-regulation and skill building over punitive measures.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the main takeaway from our deep dive seems really clear.
It does. Childhood trauma does not cause autism. They have fundamentally different origins. One is about neurodevelopment, the brain's initial wiring. The other is an acquired response to overwhelming adversity.
But, and this is the crucial but, they very often coexist. And because of that, understanding the overlap, the distinct neurobiology, the unique ways trauma can impact autistic individuals, and their heightened vulnerability, all of that is absolutely essential.
It really demands support that's tailored, that doesn't try to fit someone into just one box. Support that honors both their neurodivergence and their trauma history, recognizing that both are valid parts of their experience.
It feels like it's about moving beyond just labels and really seeing the complexity of the person and their brain.
Exactly. When we understand how brains can develop differently and how they adapt to significant challenges, we're better equipped to build genuinely inclusive, compassionate systems that offer the right kind of support, rather than misunderstanding or mislabeling people.
So maybe the thought to leave you all pondering today is this. How does really grasping this distinction between inherent developmental differences and adaptive trauma responses challenge us to look past surface behaviors and truly see the whole complex individual in front of us?
And perhaps what practical steps can each of us take in our own lives, our families, our workplaces, our communities, to help create environments where all kinds of brains feel genuinely safe, seen, and understood?
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
We really hope this conversation has offered some valuable clarity on a complex and important topic.